Karen Whitfield woke up each morning to the rhythmic sound of her alarm clock, which chimed exactly at 6 a.m. sharp. It was a sound she had grown to rely on over the years, a constant in her neatly ordered life. As she rose from her queen-sized bed, the soft cotton sheets clinging to her limbs, she didn't need to glance at the clock. The first rays of sunlight would gently filter through the white blinds of her bedroom window, bathing the room in a golden glow. She had designed every inch of her house to feel like a sanctuary, with clean lines and carefully chosen decor. The walls were painted a soft cream, adorned with tasteful artwork in muted tones. Every morning, Karen followed the same routine. She spent 15 minutes in the bathroom, brushing her teeth with meticulous care, followed by a quick skincare regimen. Next, she'd head to the kitchen, where she prepared her breakfast, a small bowl of oatmeal with sliced fruit and a freshly brewed cup of organic coffee. She took her coffee black, with no room for distractions or the sweetness of sugar, reflecting her desire for simplicity and control. The entire process took exactly 25 minutes, and she prided herself on the efficiency of her morning ritual. After breakfast, she would pull on her running shoes and step outside for a quick jog around the neighborhood. The suburb where Karen lived was an oasis of serenity, everything in its place, with immaculate lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and rows of houses that looked as though they had been plucked from a glossy magazine. Karen reveled in the predictability of it all. As she jogged, she exchanged polite smiles with neighbors she had known for years, people who were as orderly and controlled as she was. This neighborhood, Maple Grove, had become a symbol of safety and predictability for Karen. It was a place where the rhythm of life rarely deviated from the expected course. In the mornings, Karen would wave to Mrs. Lawson, who was always out watering her roses, and exchange pleasantries with Mr. Davidson, who often stood by his garage meticulously polishing his car. Everything about the neighborhood was meticulously curated, from the type of flowers that bloomed in each yard to the absence of noise or chaos. It was quiet, calm, and, most importantly, safe. Maple Grove was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and shared a common understanding of how things should be. There was an unspoken rule that everyone kept their lawns tidy, parked their cars neatly, and avoided causing a disturbance. It was a place where appearances mattered, and people took pride in their homes and their reputation within the community. As Karen jogged through the tree-lined streets, she admired the symmetry of the neighborhood. The houses were all constructed in a similar style, modern with a touch of classic charm, each one standing as an epitome of suburban perfection. Each house had its own space, with neat fences that separated the front yards from one another. The homes had been designed with a sense of order that matched the rhythm of the lives lived within them. Occasionally, Karen would pass by the local park, where well-groomed children played on swings and parents stood around chatting. There was a sense of shared purpose in the air, a collective effort to maintain the peace and tranquility that the neighborhood was known for. The small local cafe, where Karen often grabbed her morning coffee before her jog, was another example of the town's uniformity. It was owned by a friendly couple who had lived in Maple Grove for decades. The walls were adorned with pictures of the neighborhood's history, and the scent of fresh pastries filled the air every morning. Everything about Maple Grove felt predictable, and that was exactly how Karen liked it. For Karen, control was the foundation of her identity. She was a woman who thrived on order, from the precise way she folded her clothes to the way she organized her pantry. Everything in her life was carefully planned and executed. She didn't like surprises, especially those that didn't fit into her carefully constructed worldview. She believed that if she could maintain order in her own life, she could also control the world around her. This sense of control extended to her interactions with others. Karen was always pleasant, always polite, but there was a subtle judgment behind her smile. If someone's behavior didn't align with her sense of order, she couldn't help but look down on them, if only slightly. She was a woman who liked things to stay exactly as they were. And for the most part, that had been the case in Maple Grove. She had lived here for over a decade, and in all that time, very little had changed. People came and went, of course, but the neighborhood had remained largely the same. The small circle of people who lived in the area had created a culture of uniformity. If anyone ever moved in who seemed different, Karen couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort. Her thoughts often drifted to the recent changes in the neighborhood. There had been rumors for weeks about new neighbors moving into the house next door. Karen had overheard snippets of conversations at the cafe, and although she didn't usually gossip, the idea of new people joining the neighborhood stirred something in her. The house next door had been vacant for months, its lawn left untended and the windows dark. But now, a moving truck had appeared one afternoon, and Karen couldn't help but notice the flurry of activity next door. She wasn't the type to get involved in the affairs of others, unless, of course, they disrupted the peace of her neatly structured world. Karen had a habit of observing her neighbors, not in a malicious way, but with a keen eye for detail. She noticed the little things. The manner in which people dressed, the kind of cars they drove, the company they kept. In the back of her mind, she had begun to wonder about the new family moving in next door. What kind of people were they? Would they fit in with the rest of the neighborhood, or would they disturb the delicate balance of the suburb? And so, as the days passed, Karen found herself increasingly intrigued by the new neighbors, a quiet curiosity building within her. She was determined to keep an eye on the situation. There was a nagging sense that things might not remain as perfect as they had always been, and that thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The moving truck pulled up to the house next door on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Karen, just finishing her routine jog around the neighborhood, noticed the activity from the corner of her eye as she rounded the corner of Maple Grove. She slowed her pace and turned her head, her curiosity piqued. A man in his 50s was unloading boxes from the truck, his movements relaxed and efficient. He was dressed in a plain blue t-shirt and jeans, his dark skin a stark contrast against the pristine white house and the surrounding manicured lawns. Karen watched from a distance, noting the ease with which he seemed to interact with the movers. His voice was warm, filled with a calm that suggested he was no stranger to hard work, but also no hurry. He had a welcoming smile as he spoke, and his laugh was genuine, carrying across the yard. It wasn't the first time Karen had seen someone new move in, but there was something about him that made her pause. She didn't make a habit of engaging with strangers, especially those who didn't seem to fit into the mold of the good neighbor she had come to expect. He didn't appear to be a polished professional, someone who shared the same values of order and routine. No, this man seemed different. His presence, however mild and friendly, felt like an intrusion on the carefully constructed world Karen had come to treasure. His appearance was unremarkable in a physical sense. Tall, with a stocky build, his graying hair giving him a dignified air, but it was his demeanor that unsettled Karen. There was no frantic rush to make the house look perfect, no concern with fitting in or blending with the neighborhood's expected style. He was just there, a steady figure in a world that wasn't quite what Karen had imagined. The next few days did nothing to calm Karen's growing discomfort. She found herself paying more attention to his comings and goings, though she tried to convince herself it was out of curiosity, nothing more. There was always a steady stream of visitors, friends, family, and strangers, some arriving in cars that were not the usual polished vehicles Karen was accustomed to seeing in Maple Grove. The first afternoon, a group of young men gathered on the porch, laughing boisterously as they unloaded boxes from the truck. Karen tried to ignore the sound, but it echoed through the otherwise quiet neighborhood like a discordant note. Her eyes flicked to the house, her judgmental thoughts bubbling beneath the surface. Why weren't they being more discreet? Why was the energy so loud? It wasn't just the noise that set her on edge. It was the realization that the new neighbor wasn't following the expected rules of the community. He didn't seem to be preoccupied with appearances. There were no fancy cars parked neatly in the driveway. His visitors didn't dress in the crisp, professional manner she was used to. The house itself, though newly painted, seemed to lack the pristine polish of the other homes in the neighborhood. There was an authenticity to the man's presence that contrasted with Karen's desire for immaculate, controlled order. Later that week, as Karen sipped her coffee at the cafe, she overheard a conversation between a couple of her regular acquaintances, Mrs. Lawson and Mrs. Dunn. "He's not like the rest of us," Mrs. Lawson murmured, her voice hushed but filled with a quiet disdain. Karen's ears perked up, sensing something familiar in the words. "I don't know what he's doing here," Mrs. Dunn added. "I've never seen him around these parts before. Seems like an odd fit, doesn't it?" Karen felt a flicker of discomfort, but she didn't engage. She simply nodded as she continued to sip her coffee, the words reverberating in her mind. Something about them felt off, even though Karen didn't want to admit it. The new neighbor was different, and that difference stirred up a sense of unease in her, one that she didn't fully understand. As the week wore on, Karen began to notice more subtle things about her new neighbor. One evening, as she was tending to her own garden, she saw him on his front porch, chatting with a woman whose voice was familiar. She recognized her from one of the local community events, a well-meaning but somewhat loud personality who didn't quite fit the picture of decorum Karen believed was necessary in a neighborhood like Maple Grove. They spoke animatedly, laughing in a way that sounded inappropriate for the quiet, reserved environment Karen prided herself on. The woman's casual dress, a bright orange summer dress with large flowers, contrasted sharply with the subdued tones of the neighborhood, and Karen couldn't help but feel that this encounter was another subtle violation of the rules she had internalized. Why were they talking so freely, so comfortably? Why weren't they more mindful of the others around them, of the image they were portraying? The more Karen observed, the more her suspicions grew. She noticed the differences in the people who visited. Some wore clothes that looked out of place for a neighborhood like this. The cars they drove weren't the polished, top-of-the-line models she was used to seeing. A few of the visitors appeared to have tattoos, and there was the occasional loud conversation or burst of laughter from the yard that made Karen's stomach tighten. These were small things, but they seemed to signal a break from the norm. A reminder that Karen's neighborhood was, in some ways, not quite as perfect as she had imagined. For the first time in years, Karen felt her grip on her pristine world loosen just slightly. The presence of this new neighbor, with his easygoing demeanor, diverse group of visitors, and lack of concern for appearances, was like a pebble thrown into a calm pond, causing ripples she couldn't ignore. As she walked past the house that evening, Karen couldn't help but feel that something was about to change in Maple Grove, and she wasn't sure whether that change was something she could accept. Karen's unease had transformed into full-blown suspicion. What had begun as an innocent observation of her new neighbor's behavior now consumed her thoughts. It wasn't just the occasional noise or the unfamiliar visitors that unsettled her. It was the sense that something was off. The gatherings at his house had increased in frequency over the past week. Friends of varying ages came and went at all hours of the day and night. Karen had witnessed large groups standing around the porch, engaged in animated conversations, laughing, and occasionally shouting over the noise of a booming radio or music playing. The sight of teenagers hanging out on the lawn, the volume of their voices rising with each passing hour, made Karen feel an undeniable sense of dread. At first, she dismissed it, chalking it up to the natural ebb and flow of new neighbors settling in. But then she started to take note of the visitors who appeared more frequently, people Karen couldn't help but find odd, out of place. They came in mismatched clothing, often far too casual for the level of sophistication Karen believed was necessary to maintain peace in a community like Maple Grove. The cars were often beat-up models, with windows tinted too dark to reveal who was inside. There were different ages and types of people. Young adults, middle-aged men, and even people Karen couldn't quite place, all mingling in what appeared to be a complete disregard for the social norms she cherished. What really triggered Karen's growing anxiety was the way the visitors didn't seem to care about keeping things quiet. Her eyes narrowed as she watched them spill into the yard, taking up the entire space without concern for the rest of the neighborhood. The noise, the unpredictable schedules, the unfamiliar faces, all of it was overwhelming to her. Each new encounter with her neighbor's guests confirming the suspicions that had begun to brew. To Karen, this wasn't just a neighbor. This was a disruption, a challenge to the rules that had been set in place. And as the days passed, her frustration festered, turning into something darker, a sense of righteous indignation that kept her on edge. In the privacy of her own home, Karen replayed the events over and over in her mind. The loud music from the backyard, the strangers laughing too loudly in the middle of the afternoon, the fast-moving cars that seemed to come and go without warning. They weren't just disturbing her peace, they were threatening it. She had tried to convince herself that it was no big deal at first, but now she couldn't deny that there was something more insidious happening right next door. Each evening, she heard the sounds of activity through the walls of her house. The last straw came when one evening, A group of teenagers started an impromptu basketball game in the street right in front of her neighbor's house. The sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement seemed to echo in her mind long after they left, leaving her fuming in frustration. She had tried to confront her neighbor, but each time she stepped outside, he wasn't around. He had this calm, easygoing way about him that seemed to evade any attempts at a genuine conversation. His dismissive smile and polite words were enough to make Karen feel that any concerns she voiced would be brushed aside. He wasn't listening. No, he didn't need to, because he knew he wasn't doing anything wrong. And yet, in Karen's mind, the growing presence of outsiders was more than she could tolerate. Karen paced the floor of her living room, feeling the anger rise up again, along with the sense of powerlessness. The thought that someone was out of control, doing as they pleased without regard for the community's rules, gnawed at her. That was when the decision was made. She didn't need to sit idly by and let this disturbance continue. She could do something. It was her duty, wasn't it? She had the right to protect her home, her peaceful surroundings. She could already feel the satisfaction of reclaiming order. It was only a matter of doing the right thing. And the right thing, Karen told herself, was to call the police. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the non-emergency police line. The line rang, and her heart pounded in her chest as she waited. She had never made a call like this before. Was she doing the right thing? Her mind battled with the urge to second-guess herself. She was only doing what needed to be done. The officer on the other end answered. "Hello, this is Officer Harris. How can I assist you?" Karen's voice was measured, but there was an edge to it that made her sound confident. "Hi, this is Karen Whitfield. I live at 206 Maple Grove. There's been some unusual activity going on at the house next door. I think there might be something going on over there that isn't quite right. There are people coming and going all the time, and it's disturbing the peace. It's loud, and I'm concerned it's something more than just a party. They don't seem to care about keeping things quiet or respecting the neighborhood." As she spoke, Karen could feel her emotions building, her words gaining strength as she explained the situation. "I don't know if they're causing trouble, but it doesn't feel right. They're not acting like the other people in the neighborhood. It's really unsettling." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and Karen's pulse quickened as she waited for a response. "I understand, ma'am. We'll send an officer to check it out. It might be nothing, but we'll make sure everything is okay." Relief washed over Karen. It wasn't a huge victory yet, but it was a step. She was right to feel concerned, right to take action. She could almost hear the sound of sirens in her mind, the flashing lights, and the officers stepping onto her neighbor's property to do what she couldn't. The thought of it made her feel empowered. She would have peace again. This was the first step toward restoring order in her world. The next morning, Karen sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee with a quiet satisfaction. She glanced out the window, waiting for the flashing lights, for the police to arrive and set things straight. Soon, she thought, the issue would be resolved. It wouldn't matter that the neighbor tried to play the victim. He had crossed the line by not fitting in, by disturbing the peace of this carefully curated community. Sure enough, later that afternoon, Karen heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Her heart beat faster as she peered out the window, watching the police car roll slowly down the street, its lights flashing a stark contrast against the otherwise peaceful backdrop of Maple Grove. The officers pulled up to her neighbor's house, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Karen's pulse quickened, her anticipation mounting as she watched the officers get out of their vehicle, their uniforms crisp and official. The officer closest to her neighbor's house approached the door. From her vantage point, Karen saw the neighbor step outside to greet the officers, a puzzled look on his face. The scene that unfolded before her felt oddly satisfying, like a resolution was finally unfolding. She could only imagine the conversation that was taking place, the questions, the explanations, and the eventual judgment. She could feel herself bracing for the moment when her neighbor would realize that the rules of the neighborhood, the rules Karen had fought so hard to preserve, had been upheld. She stared out the window for a long time, barely able to contain her growing sense of triumph. There was a flicker of movement as the conversation continued, but Karen's focus was entirely on the officers and their approach to the situation. For once, It felt like the world was being put back into balance. But what Karen didn't realize, as she stood there savoring the moment, was that the real story was just beginning to unfold. The tension in the air thickened as Karen stood by her window, peering out at the unfolding drama. The police car sat in front of her neighbor's house, its flashing lights illuminating the quiet suburban street, contrasting sharply against the calm evening sky. Karen watched as the officers approached the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a rush of satisfaction, a vindication of her decision. This was her moment. Finally, the unruly neighbor, the one who had disrupted her perfect little world, would face the consequences of his actions. The officers, two of them, one tall, the other more stout, made their way to the front porch. Karen couldn't hear their words from where she stood, but she saw the neighbor step outside to greet them. Her neighbor, the man she had come to view with suspicion, remained eerily calm, his demeanor far from the frantic, defensive response Karen had imagined. His facial expression was a mixture of mild curiosity and cool composure, a stark contrast to the tense emotions swirling in Karen's chest. The officers spoke briefly, exchanging words in a low tone. Karen's eyes narrowed as she observed, expecting the officers to be stern, perhaps even accusatory. But instead, the taller officer, whose uniform glinted in the afternoon sun, flipped through a small notebook and then glanced up at the neighbor with a look of respect. Karen's confusion deepened as she saw the exchange unfold. The officer, nodding slightly, spoke in a tone that was almost deferential. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Reynolds. We'll need to confirm a few details, but everything seems to be in order." Mr. Reynolds. Karen's mind raced as she tried to remember his first name. She'd never bothered to ask him directly, only referring to him in her mind as the new neighbor, or worse, the stranger next door. Her brows furrowed, but she kept watching, her curiosity piqued. She had assumed the officer would be questioning him, probing him about the noise, the visitors, the unsettling atmosphere that had permeated the neighborhood. But instead, the officers were treating him with the kind of deference one might reserve for a colleague, not a random resident causing a disturbance. The second officer pulled out a small tablet from his bag, displaying an ID badge. "It's all in the system," he confirmed, still addressing Mr. Reynolds with a calm, respectful demeanor. The first officer nodded again, scanning the area around them. Karen's stomach twisted. This wasn't how she had imagined the situation playing out. She had expected the officers to sternly reprimand him for breaking the peace, to validate her suspicions about his behavior. Instead, it seemed that the more the officers learned about her neighbor, the more respectful they became. She couldn't make sense of it. But it wasn't until the moment when one of the officers spoke again that everything came crashing down. "Mr. Reynolds," the officer said, his voice firm but respectful, "we'll be in touch regarding the investigation, but we just need to finalize a few things." Karen froze. Investigation? What investigation? Her mind whirled as she tried to make sense of the words she had overheard. She had thought her neighbor was just some ordinary man, someone who had no respect for the neighborhood and no regard for the rules that governed it. But what she was hearing now didn't add up. The officers exchanged one last look before turning to leave. "We'll let you know if anything else comes up," the taller officer said, offering a respectful nod to Mr. Reynolds. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was happening. She stepped away from the window, her heart racing as she moved toward the front door. Her eyes were glued to the scene outside as she pushed the door open just a crack, barely enough to hear the last part of the conversation. The voices outside faded in and out, but one final sentence pierced through the air, loud enough for Karen to catch. "Mr. Reynolds, we appreciate your patience. We'll be in touch about the local investigation. And thank you for your service as the FBI director." FBI director? The words echoed in her ears like a bombshell, crashing into her reality and shattering it. Her mouth went dry, her body frozen in shock. She had misjudged him. She had assumed the worst. All along, her neighbor had been a high-ranking official in the FBI, a man who was likely investigating something much more serious than the ordinary neighborhood complaints she had about noise and visitors. Karen stumbled backward, her back hitting the door frame as the weight of the realization settled in. Her suspicions, her judgments, her entire perception of Mr. Reynolds had been completely wrong. She had painted him with the same brush she used to categorize anyone who didn't fit the mold of what she thought was acceptable. And now, as the truth washed over her, she was left feeling small, embarrassed, and utterly ashamed. As the realization sank in, Karen felt a wave of guilt sweep over her. She had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, dismissing the complexity of her neighbor's life in favor of a simple, shallow narrative. All those days she had spent eyeing his house, scrutinizing his visitors, crafting assumptions about his character based on his appearance, on his behavior. None of it had been based on truth. She had let herself be consumed by prejudice, allowing her discomfort with change to steer her decisions. Karen leaned against the door, feeling dizzy as she tried to process the scene unfolding before her. The police car was now slowly pulling away, its sirens fading into the distance. Mr. Reynolds remained on his porch, his calm demeanor unwavering. How had she never suspected something more? How had she failed to see beyond the surface? In that moment, everything about the way she viewed the world felt wrong. Her vision of herself as a vigilant, concerned neighbor, someone simply doing her part to maintain order, crumbled. What was more disturbing than the noise and the visitors next door was the deep-seated bias she had carried without even realizing it. She had seen her neighbor through the lens of fear and judgment, convinced that he didn't belong. But now, the man she had so hastily labeled a threat was a respected figure in the community, someone who had more knowledge and authority than she ever could. Karen's chest tightened as she closed the door, retreating into the quiet of her home. She stood in the center of her living room, her mind racing. Everything she had believed was now in question. Had she truly seen the world as it was, or had she simply constructed a reality based on what made her feel comfortable? The truth had revealed itself, and it left her stunned, shaken to the core. As the reality of her actions continued to sink in, Karen could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She had acted out of fear, out of bias, and in doing so, she had not only misjudged a person but also betrayed her own values. There was no turning back now. Karen knew the road ahead would require more than just apologies. It would require self-reflection, change, and, perhaps most difficult of all, confronting the truth she had so long avoided. The days following the revelation felt like an emotional whirlwind for Karen. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, keeping her life neat and predictable. But now, nothing felt right. She could barely look at herself in the mirror without feeling the sting of guilt. Her thoughts were filled with regret, and the more she reflected, the clearer it became that her actions had been fueled by prejudice, not genuine concern. Each day, she replayed the events in her mind, asking herself how she had missed the truth. How had she allowed fear and discomfort to cloud her judgment so thoroughly? She realized that it wasn't just about the police call. It was the underlying assumption that people who were different, who didn't fit into her carefully crafted world, were somehow less trustworthy. The neighbor she had once seen as a threat had, in fact, been a man of great importance, someone who served and protected in ways Karen could never have imagined. Her baseless assumptions had done more than just harm him. They had exposed the flaws in her own character. She was ashamed of how she had treated him and felt a deep sense of sorrow for the way she had reacted out of ignorance and fear. Karen spent sleepless nights contemplating how to make amends, how to redeem herself in the eyes of her community. She couldn't simply apologize and move on. What she had done required action, not just words. She knew she needed to take responsibility and repair the damage she had caused. It was time for her to make a change, to shift her perspective and show that she could learn from this painful experience. But where to begin? After much reflection, Karen made a decision that would become the turning point in her journey. She would organize a community event, one that would invite neighbors from all backgrounds to come together. It wasn't enough to simply apologize to Mr. Reynolds. It was essential to build a bridge between herself and the other residents, to foster understanding and empathy where there had been none. Karen contacted local organizations, reached out to community leaders, and even enlisted the help of Mr. Reynolds, who, to her surprise, agreed to assist. The event was designed to be a gathering for open conversation, with games, food, and discussions on diversity, inclusion, and mutual respect. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Many of the residents, particularly those who had been as uncomfortable with change as she was, might not see the need for such an event. But Karen was determined. She poured herself into the planning, hoping that by leading the charge, she could show her commitment to making things right. Weeks passed, and the event finally arrived. As the sun dipped behind the suburban rooftops, Karen stood at the center of the park where the gathering was taking place, her heart racing. The tables were adorned with banners reading "Unity and Diversity," and the smell of freshly prepared food wafted through the air. People trickled in, some cautiously, others with eager smiles. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Mr. Reynolds. When he finally arrived, she felt a weight lift from her chest. He was there, standing with a welcoming expression, despite the tension that had existed between them. Karen knew this would be her moment to show her sincerity. As the event unfolded, she found herself in conversations with people she had once overlooked, learning about their lives, their struggles, and their experiences. The evening was filled with laughter, shared stories, and, most importantly, connection. For the first time, Karen felt a sense of true community, not the perfect, homogeneous world she had once strived for, but one that was real and full of color. When it was time for Karen to address the crowd, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. Her voice was shaky, but resolute. "I want to begin by saying that I have made a mistake. I have allowed my biases and fears to guide my actions, and for that, I am deeply sorry," Karen began, her gaze shifting to Mr. Reynolds. "I wrongfully judged a neighbor, someone who deserves respect, and in doing so, I hurt not only him but all of you who were impacted by my actions." The words spilled out, each one a weight lifted from her chest. She continued, "This event is just a small step in what I hope will be a much larger journey of understanding, healing, and reconciliation. I've learned that we are all so much more than the assumptions we make about each other, and I will work every day to be better, to see the world through a wider lens, and to be a neighbor who embraces all people, regardless of their background or appearance." The crowd was silent at first, and then, one by one, people began to clap. Karen's heart soared as she glanced at Mr. Reynolds, who gave her a nod of approval, his face softening with a smile. This moment wasn't just an apology, it was the beginning of something new, something that could reshape the entire neighborhood. The event had been a resounding success. People left feeling lighter, more connected, and hopeful about the future. Karen had proven herself not only by taking responsibility for her actions, but also by showing up and actively working to change the narrative in her community. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but the seeds of change had been planted. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed, Karen found herself sitting on the porch with Mr. Reynolds. They shared a quiet meal, just the two of them, and for the first time since he had moved in, Karen felt like she was seeing him as a person, not an idea, a stereotype, or a threat. He shared stories of his work, his family, and his experiences, things Karen had never bothered to learn before. And as they ate together, the unease that had once defined their relationship began to dissipate. The evening ended with a simple gesture. Karen extended her hand toward Mr. Reynolds, offering him her friendship. He took it with a smile, the unspoken understanding between them clear. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Karen, but for the entire neighborhood. The walls of prejudice that had once separated them were crumbling, replaced by mutual respect and shared humanity. Karen's transformation is a powerful reminder of the impact that prejudice and bias can have on our relationships and communities. It's a call for all of us to reflect on our own assumptions and to challenge the walls that divide us. If you've ever faced a similar moment of self-discovery, we'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful stories about personal growth, empathy, and the journey toward understanding. Let's build a world where unity and respect are at the forefront of our interactions.